Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Cap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome everybody to Season 4, Episode 51 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail in Week 15, the first round of your fantasy football playoffs, and the rest of your 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me, as always, is Nick Cap. Nick, we're in the playoffs. I think you're in 6 leagues total. I'm in 4 leagues total, 5 leagues total. Okay. How many playoffs did you make, and how are you feeling heading into your playoffs?
So I got one close game that it's going to come down to. If I win, I'm in. Lose, I'm out. One I missed in our league. Our league, I did not expect to make it. Me and Nick did a big trade at the trade deadline. Gave him a guy, keeper format, wanted that. 2 leagues, bye. 1 league, 3 seed, playing for the next round. So pretty good fantasy season. We'll see how it wraps. How about you? How was your fantasy? How's your fantasy outlook?
My fantasy outlook. So I'm in 4 leagues, and I should note, guys, we're recording before the Monday Night Football game, so there is a little bit of matchups here that aren't decided. I'm in 4 leagues. I missed in one by literally one week. I had the most points against. It was just one of those years where I ended up having T. Higgins and DK and Jonathan Taylor, a couple guys that kept on getting hurt. It's a very small roster, and I missed it by a game. And here's the unfortunate thing, Nick. My opponent this week is the guy I needed to beat to get in. I beat him, but he's now going to have the points tiebreaker by about 30 points. So that's unfortunate. I wish it was like a win-in situation. I would have gotten him, but I'm in my other 3 leagues. I have a bye in one. The other 2 leagues looking like I'll be the 4th seed in both, including our league. And I think I'm 4th in points against. Those are points forced. Those are both 12-man leagues. So I'm happy with my teams. The trade that we made got me Kyren Williams. And you didn't have a bad year in our league. You're missing the playoffs by a game, and you had just traded Kyren Williams, who's had back-to-back good weeks. So if you don't make that trade, maybe you sneak in, but you were right on the cusp. This is the tightest our league has ever been. So we're excited about that. We're excited about the fantasy football playoffs. We're excited to do this show for you guys, and we're excited to welcome in all of our new listeners. I know there was a little bit of a rub. I was interviewing with John Gruden and Dave Portnoy and Barstool this weekend. I didn't really share that publicly, but it's absolutely public. Everything that's public is everything that was kind of shot. It seems like a lot of you guys enjoyed that content. So appreciate the love that you guys are giving to the Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. The reason that we've done this show for now 4 years, 200 plus episodes, is we love fantasy football. We love each other, best friends of 25 years or 23 years, something like that. And we love helping you guys win your fantasy football matchups. And that's our goal every single time we come on air, whether it's during this show or a live show. So with that said, this is the Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. You can find us on our YouTube channel or all audio streaming platforms if you prefer to listen in a podcasting form. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit a bell icon so you get notifications every single time we go live. If you're listening on an audio streaming platform, we're on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Anchor. If you're on iTunes or Spotify, please give us a 5-star rating and a review. We would really appreciate that. We're also on social media, most active on Instagram and Twitter/X. Twitter and X is Primetime FF Pod. Instagram is Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. If you do have any fantasy football related questions during the week, if you have questions on your Sundays, we do a live show every Sunday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, available on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. We do highly recommend checking that out on YouTube, as we have a nice Q format. We can pop up the questions on the screen, and we answer all of your fantasy football questions in great depth to help you set those lineups and win that week. We have a fun little community that does join us every single week. Viewers that will pop in and out and talk with each other. So it's a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys can join us for that this Sunday for week 15. Today is our Tuesday show. On our Tuesday show, we do 2 segments. Our waiver wire segment, which does get shorter and shorter as the weeks go on due to the nature of the waiver wire. And then we end our show with the second segment, our top 5 fantasy football takeaways from that week. But at this point, it's kind of a trend on the season, or maybe a trend for the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And then we give you guys a Thursday/Friday show. We're all boom and all bust teams. I say Thursday/Friday because we sometimes record on a Wednesday night to get the Thursday night football games in. Sometimes our schedules conflict and we do Thursday night. But this week, I can confirm with you guys, will be a Thursday show, again, available on our YouTube and our audio streaming platforms. The waiver wire, Nick, and like I said, does get smaller and smaller as the weeks go on. I don't think there's really a slam dunk waiver player here. I wish that I could say differently, but we do have a list of players, a bunch of running backs, a couple receivers, a couple quarterbacks, tight end, and some defenses even to help you both with week 15 of your playoffs and the rest of the playoffs within your 2024 fantasy football season. So these percentages are based off ESPN. We had to give a platform, so we did base it off of ESPN. So starting off with the quarterbacks, Matthew Stafford is owned in 38.1% of ESPN fantasy football leagues. His playoff schedule is San Francisco, the New York Giants, and the Arizona Cardinals. Aaron Rodgers, Knicks guy, is owned in 39.1% of ESPN leagues. He's facing the Jaguars, the Rams, and the Bills in the fantasy football playoffs. Then there's Jameis Winston, who we've advocated for on this show. He's owned in 19.9% of leagues. Kansas City Chiefs, Cincinnati Bengals, and the Miami Dolphins. Nick, if you had to take one for this week, who would you take? And then if you had to take one for the rest of the playoffs, who would you take?
So if I'm taking one for the week, I want Rodgers. I want that Jacksonville matchup. Stafford, that San Fran matchup, that does not sound fun. It's Thursday night, which is fun. The Rams offense has been on fire as of late. Jameis, Kansas City, they just keep every one of these games low as much as Jameis has been matchup proof. I don't know if I love that one. Rodgers definitely has the easiest matchup. If I'm looking at the fantasy playoffs, I'm looking at 9 games between Stafford and his 3, Rodgers and his 3, and Jameis and his 3. The number one game that looks the most appetizing to me is Jameis eating that W up against Cincinnati Bengals. That secondary is horrible. That defense is horrible. Jameis, that passing volume is high. Those studs around him have all been executed on for your fantasy teams between Njoku, Judy, Tillman before the concussion. Elijah Moore's got some good games in there. They all rotate the rock, and they all dominate for your fantasy team. So Jameis, for me, is the one I want if you need to play somebody for all 3. But if you're on that bye, Jameis is the one I want for 2 weeks from now.
I do completely agree on Aaron Rodgers. He'll carve up that Jaguars defense. It's one of the worst in the league. He just had his first game with over 300 passing yards in 2 years or something like that. The Jaguars also allowed the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks, an average of 21.4. And to back up your Jameis take a little bit, the Bengals going into Monday Night Football this week allowed the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks at 20.2. But I'm going to disagree on who would want the rest of the playoffs. I'd actually want Matthew Stafford. Stafford's been on fire at this point. Nick, you had him in the Rams offense in your top 5 offenses heading into the fantasy football season. And now that the Rams have been fully healthy, 4 consecutive games now at 15 plus fantasy points, 3 of them over 19, 2 of them over 20. Those are against good defenses too. The Bills are a pretty good defense, and Stafford just carved them up. I'm not worried about any of those matchups. The Jets, your Jets are banged up. That'll be the second matchup. And the Cardinals, their secondary is not great. So I'm not worried about the Rams at all. The other thing about the Rams is they are fighting for that NFC West crown. The Seahawks, actually all 4 teams, I should say, are all fighting for the NFC West. So I like playing guys that have a lot to play for. And I know these guys have contracts and bonuses, but the playoffs are a little bit different. Stafford's older. You know that window is closing. I think they're really going to try to fight to make the playoffs. So I'm all in on Stafford if you have to play him all 3 of those weeks. Running backs, again, guys, this is a deep waiver wire. And I will say this, we only will talk about waiver players that are owned in 50% of leagues or less. There's no reason to talk about somebody that's owned in most of your leagues. So for running backs, the first one we have here is Tank Bigsby, owned at 36.5% of leagues. His playoff schedule is the Jets, the Raiders, and the Titans. McCormick on the Raiders is owned in 12% of fantasy football leagues. He has the Falcons, the Jags, and the Saints. Isaiah Davis on the Jets is owned in 4% of fantasy football leagues. He has the Jaguars, the Rams, and the Bills. And then we have 2 49ers running backs. It looks like Gerendo is going to be okay. We don't know if he's going to play Thursday, so maybe pick up a 49ers back if you need somebody to play Thursday. Patrick Taylor Jr., he had a touchdown, 4% of fantasy football leagues. The Rams is Thursday. Then the Dolphins and the Lions. And then Israel, I can't pronounce this one.
The nickname's just Izzy. We'll roll with that.
Izzy Abenaconda. I hope I didn't butcher that. If I did, I apologize. Only 2% of fantasy football leagues, the Rams, the Dolphins, and the Lions. So, Nick, who do you like out of these running backs?
I mean, I definitely want a 49ers running back. Any single one of them that's been in there, whether it's McCaffrey last year and years before with Elijah Mitchell, Jordan Mason at the start of the year, Garendo this past week, they all just explode behind this offensive line. And I want the right one. I do not think Garendo is going to get out there on the short week. I know it's a division matchup. Patrick Taylor was the biggest benefactor. Izzy signed before this week, but he was a healthy scratch. He didn't know the playbook. He wasn't ready to start. If he is out there, Izzy is a great running back. He was a Jets running back for 1 year. He had a good rookie showing. They took Braylon Allen later in the draft to be the bigger back to pair with Breece Hall. Izzy was more similar to that Breece Hall build. And I'm not saying he's going to be Breece Hall, but with that 49ers system, any running back thrives. I think Izzy is the sleeper of the week, and I think he's the guy that you don't want to play this week because you just do not know. It's very hard to risk. But if you see the usage and the workload on Thursday, he is a locked and loaded player for your lineups on for week 16 and week 17. The number one to me is going to be Patrick Taylor, because I think that is the locked and loaded RB1 for the 49ers this week. As you mentioned, Nick, you want a player that's got win or go home, and the 49ers are fighting for that division. I think it is going to be run the ball, run the ball, run the ball all over Sean McVay and that Rams team.
I agree with you that I would like to get Patrick Taylor if possible, at least for Thursday night. Going forward, I still think it's going to be Gerendo, which concerns me a little bit. You might want to go at Tank here if you need, if you have the bye, even to play keep away, because somebody else might need a starting running back. You might want to just grab Tank to play keep away, because at this point he does look like the starter on the Jaguars. His playoff schedule is very tough. I'm not sure when or where you would play him. Raiders, they're not the best against the run, but they're not the worst. And Tennessee's been pretty tough against the run, so I would not want to play him. So, moving on to wide receivers, you have Nick's guy Cedric Tillman, who he told you weeks ago to pick up. He's been dropped in a bunch of leagues, only owned in 36% of leagues, missed the last 2 weeks due to a concussion, a pretty bad concussion it seems like. So we'll see if he comes back, but it might be one to stash, at least knowing that he has a good connection with Jameis Winston. Then we have Ray McLeod on his playoff matchups. I should note the Chiefs, the Bengals, and the Dolphins. Ray McLeod owned in 12% of fantasy football leagues, going up against the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders. A pretty easy matchup for all Falcons, really, in the playoffs. And then Jalen McMillan, the rookie on the Bucs, had his best game of his NFL career and fantasy football career. 2 scores, only owned in 8.5% of fantasy football leagues. The Chargers, the Cowboys, and the Panthers. It's a very easy back half of that schedule. The Chargers are tough, but that back half is pretty appetizing. I'd be in on giving McMillan a shot.
Yeah, I like the McMillan shout. I think those 2 games make a lot of sense. And if you're in that spot, if you have a team shutting players down, that's kind of the downside of fantasy, where it's at the end of the year. And if you got a guy that's dinged up, you just shut him down for the year if you're not making the playoffs. I think Ray McLeod's got the most to fight for here. They're going to be fighting for a playoff spot. His last 2 games have been very solid. His workload has been solid in those 2 games, even with Kirk Cousins not looking good. And if they decide to make the switch to Penix, it's been rumored for 2 weeks that they might pull the trigger. Cousins' last 4 games, 8 interceptions, 0 touchdowns. They still have a shot at that division. They have the tiebreaker with Tampa Bay. They need to just win 1 more game than them. I think it's a very good opportunity for McLeod to be a very big piece of your fantasy team down the stretch.
I like the stretch here of McMillan. I liked what I saw on Sunday. Baker really hasn't found a second target. Kate Otten was kind of the second target for a while. Rashad White does get a ton of PPR workload, but in terms of an actual second receiver option who's running deeper routes, we haven't seen one. So I'm okay with taking the shot here on McMillan, even if you're stashing him for the next week or 2. And again, possibly playing keep away. That's the other thing, guys. If you have a spot on your bench, it should either be for a defense that you're going to use or play keep away from any position. You should not be wasting a spot on your bench when there is competition on the waiver wire. If you have to, stash 5 defenses. Do something to play keep away from your opponents. The only tight end we have listed here, and tight end is such a thin position, and I wanted to put Ertz on there, owned in close to 70% of leagues. Wanted to put Hunter Henry, owned in 50% of leagues. At this point, Jonnu Smith is owned in every league. We have here Juwan Johnson, who's emerged as a top receiving target for the Saints, owned in 13.9% of leagues. Matchups against the Commanders, the Packers, and the Raiders. My only concern here is that Derek Carr is not going to be the quarterback. And the tight end waiver wire is so thin. There really isn't another solid option available at this point that we could recommend picking up for the entirety of the playoffs. At this point, play roulette and pick one up and hope for the touchdown. And we'd be happy to answer any tight end questions that you guys might have on our Sunday morning live show this week at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time.
Yeah, exactly. I think Juwan Johnson, I agree with Nick. He is the number 1 guy on the waivers. There's not really too much available left unless if you got lucky and someone dropped someone. Maybe one of these teams where there were 6 buys this past week, you got lucky and someone dropped somebody, but more than likely not. If you do need someone, it is going to be Juwan Johnson in that situation, but definitely concerns without Carr there.
Take a look and see if Jake Ferguson is dropped in any of your leagues, especially after this Monday night game. If he does put up a stinker, he'll be facing the Panthers next week, who give up the most fantasy points to tight ends. Again, I do not think he'll be available. I'm naming guys that probably aren't available. David Njoku against the Chiefs. They let up a lot of points to tight ends again. Probably not available. I'm looking for guys that might be available in your deeper leagues or guys that maybe are dropped, but the Raiders or the Falcons. Pitts probably hasn't been dropped, but if he has, go pick up Kyle Pitts. He has a positive matchup last week. And I'll give you one more. The Bengals are facing the Titans next week. Chig Okonawu, we love him on this show, and he's a physical specimen. He's fast. I think he could break one off. I think Chiggy might be my deep dive sleeper for next week. The Bengals going into Monday Night Football allow the fourth most points to tight ends, an average of 12.5. I know it doesn't sound great, but these are tight ends we're talking about. I think Chiggy's the guy I'd actually go for if you need one for next week. But at this point, you'd be shooting for the playoffs. All right, and lastly, we have some defenses just for this week to consider. The Baltimore Ravens going up against the New York Giants at the Giants. Somebody may have dropped them during the bye week. Knicks Jets going up against Mac Jones and the Jaguars. Not a revenge game, but Mac Jones definitely knows your Jets. And lastly, the Commanders going up against the Saints. I don't know who's going to suit up for the Saints. It might be Spencer Rattler. It looks like...
I think it's going to be Jake Haener.
Oh, man, that's so bad.
That's even worse.
That's a name that me and Nick would have used playing Madden. Back in the day, me and Nick would do 3 randoms on Madden, but we'd have to use the backup quarterback. So this might be Madden 18, 19. We knew every backup quarterback in the league. And we knew, and we'd go nuts when one of us got the best backup quarterback. I think Foles was a backup at that point. Maybe Ryan Fitz. I can't. Jameis is a starter. Who else? The Brocket Chip. The Brocket Chip was in there.
Yep.
There's definitely 1 or 2 other funny nicknames that we liked. But
for sure.
Anyway, all right, guys. That is our waiver wire heading into week 15. And our last and second final segment for the show is our top 5 takeaways from week 14 with a fantasy football perspective behind them. Nick normally does a theme. I don't normally do a theme. I normally do maybe like 4 of a theme and then go somewhere else. But I actually do have a theme. I beat Nick to the punch this time, and I do have a theme for mine. So I'm assuming Nick has a theme, and if he doesn't, that's a bad look. So I think we have 2 themes for you guys, and here's the way this segment works. I know people love countdowns, and we probably could have made this a countdown, but it's not a countdown segment. It's just 5 takeaways that we have, normally based on this previous week. But now that we're 14 weeks in and the playoffs coming up, it could be a look ahead, maybe even a dynasty look ahead. It could be something about the entirety of the season. So anyway, Nick, what is the first takeaway that you would like to speak about, and which is your theme?
So my theme, and this is very relevant for your fantasy football playoffs right now, I wanted to take a look at who is on an absolute heater, whether it's an offense, whether it's a player. And I said, last 4 weeks, what have you given me? Have you dominated fantasy football? Have you been on an absolute run on a tear that's not getting noticed? And I went through it. Some of these guys are getting noticed, but I don't think we realize just how good. And Nick, we're going to kick it off with the Miami Dolphins, who are on an absolute run since Tua has returned from injury. Since week 11, he is the QB2. His worst game out of those 4, and we always say cold weather Tua, we do not like it. His worst game of that span is 23.5 points. He's averaging 25.2. He is only behind Josh Allen after that ridiculous game last night or yesterday evening, depending on what side of the coast you're on, afternoon. But listen, that's 4 straight top 10 performances in that span. 11 touchdowns, no picks, averaging 330 passing yards in that span. Other Dolphins, Achane, RB3, Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 4, Jalen Waddle. We talked about all the struggles, wide receiver 11, and obviously Jonnu Smith, tight end 1 in that span. Here's his next few games too. He's got the Texans, the 49ers, and the Browns, all those super high projected scoring games. You have the Texans, whose defense has not been great against quarterbacks. Their defense has let up. That Texans defense has been exposed the last few weeks. I know they're coming off the bye, but another warm weather game for Tua. San Francisco in San Fran. Not the coldest weather, but closer to the West Coast, a little bit closer to his home in Hawaii.
It's a little
chilly, but you get that Mike McDaniel against Kyle Shanahan revenge game. Not really revenge, but going to his old home. That's a good spot. And then we get the Cleveland Browns, who we just love the shootouts that we get with Jameis every single week for your championship. So I think the Miami Dolphins, trust them. If you have your doubt about Jalen Waddle, Jonnu Smith, you've seen more than enough with Tua coming back that this offense is explosive And this offense can definitely help you win in your fantasy playoffs.
We are wrong about a lot. And every fantasy analyst is wrong about a lot. And that's just the nature of the game. It's gambling, but not gambling. And no matter how many stats we throw at you or how many reasons we throw at you, we could be completely wrong. But I would like to pat me and Nick on the back. I think we have been completely right about the Miami Dolphins this season. If Tua's on the field, they're great. If Tua's not on the field, they have to be benched. We said it in our all bust teams before that both Tyreek and Waddle couldn't be played without Tua. Nick is super duper high on Achane. I was not as high on Achane. I'll raise my hand up and say it, but Nick was super duper high on the Achane train. He spoke about it in this segment, over the past month or so, that Achane really would be your running back one if it wasn't for Tua getting hurt because of his ridiculous point total when Tua's on the field. So I do want to back Nick up on this take. I think it's a take that I had also made last week about how good the Dolphins have been and how good they really could be going forward. And I think we've both had that projection. And even in our trade segment about a month and a half ago, Nick said, go trade for Jalen Waddle. Guess what I did? I went and traded for Jalen Waddle. I traded I traded Tank Bigsby. I needed a receiver. My running backs in that league are Saquon, K9, and Jahmyr Gibbs. So I really needed a receiver to pair up with Terry McLaurin and Pickens. So I took my co-host's advice, and I'm happy that I did. So I'm just going to give myself a little pat on the back for being completely right about the Dolphins throughout the entirety of the season. I'm going to speak about another quarterback, and my theme actually, Nick, is I'm going to call this your league winners. I got a couple guys that people aren't talking about enough, or maybe are talking about enough, but probably aren't. And they are league winners. And I'm going to have Baker Mayfield. And as good as he's been, I feel like he's still not really talked about. He's your quarterback 4 in the season. I did tell you guys last week I was a little bit concerned about the rushing upside that the Bucs offense has done to stifle his offensive explosion. But Baker kind of returned to form this week against the Raiders. He had a 20-plus fantasy point performance. Quarterback 4 in the season, like I said, 18-plus fantasy points in 12 of 13 games this season. It's a model of consistency. He's 4th in passing yards on the season and 3rd in passing touchdowns. That cannot change on Monday Night Football because Joe Burrow is number 1 in both categories. Mm-hmm. I won't talk about his interceptions because he's having a Jameis Winston ish. Not as bad. He has like 13 picks, but he's like 27 touchdowns or something.
Yeah.
His playoff schedule is great. A lot of playoff schedule talk here in my part of the segment, at least. He has the Chargers, who are tough. So if you have another quarterback, play somebody else this week. It's the 10th toughest defense against fantasy quarterbacks. But then you have Dallas, who allows the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And then championship week, Carolina allows the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I know he did have a tough going against Carolina last week. I don't see that being a repeat performance or problem. Baker's going to have a good week for you guys and a good playoffs, I think. I shouldn't say good week, but a good playoffs for you guys. All right, your second takeaway. What do you have?
Well, you talked about one quarterback from the 2018 draft class and a guy that got a resurgence in another team, had a pit stop at Carolina, and then finally got a starting job and looked to hold it down. Well, I got another guy that fits that same mold, and it is Sam Darnold and his Minnesota Vikings that have been going nuclear, but particularly him. And as a Jets fan, never saw this coming. Never saw it on my team. I know a lot of people that are USC guys, like our guy Nick over here, would have loved him. I did not see him having 350 yards and 5 touchdowns and no interceptions in a singular game. Never saw that in New York. But here we go. And his last 4 games, we're talking about who's on this heater, and Sam Darnold's on it. We talked to a lot of shows said he's going to go pumpkin mode and he was going to really stink it up after Halloween. Like that's kind of what it was going to trend to be. Well, here's his last 4, 24.7 points, QB3. Worst game was 19.6. We'll call it 20 for the sake of it. Here's how his receivers have benefited. Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 10 in that span. Doesn't sound great for a guy drafted that high, but then you talk about his counterpart, Jordan Addison. It's been the wide receiver 3 over the last 4 games. Absolutely insane. And then you got Aaron Jones as a top 12 running back at the RB12. Here's his schedule, and it looks tough on the surface, but let me break it down for you. Chicago at home, at Seattle, hosting Green Bay. 2 of the toughest defenses, and both in the division, Chicago and Green Bay. Does not sound fun. Seattle, little better than middle of the pack on the road. Good opportunity here. People are going to be scared. If you are on Sleeper, you see a dark red bold button next to 2 of these defenses. He played them both earlier this year. 21.5, 21.1, 300 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 pick in those games. He was phenomenal. He has been phenomenal. And I know that we all got this prerequisite in our head of this is who Sam Darnold is. He's broke the mold. He is matchup proof. He has been. And it's time that we forget Jet Sam Darnold. And it's something that I hold on to over here in the Northeast and a lot of shows hold on to. The guy's 11-2 at this point with one of the best offenses in football. If he was not in the Lions division, he would have the 1 seed in the NFC. Like that, it just is the way it is. Sam Darnold, you've earned my respect at this point, and I can't wait for us to sign you this offseason.
So 2 things. Number one, if the Vikings are in a different division, Sam Darnold might be an MVP favorite or candidate at least. Second thing, they absolutely should sign Sam Darnold in the offseason, or they could trade him for Rodgers. That'd be electric if Rodgers went to the Vikings. That'd be great.
I'm in.
I'm so in for that. That'd be great.
You could let him mentor JJ McCarthy for a year until he retires. McCarthy's still only 21 years old.
He's the entire Brett Favre route. That'd be great.
Do it. Go for it.
That's a great story. It's a great story.
Great to me.
I'm going to talk about one of my receivers on my team, not any of my fantasy football teams, but my team, Jackson Smith and Jigba. And one of my takes last week was that you can't trust the Seahawks offense for fantasy football besides JSN. And now this take is JSN to the moon, and here's why. Mm-hmm. He was a wide receiver 14 in week 14, and that's okay. I know that doesn't sound super flashy, but he had 19.6 fantasy points. That's a pretty good fantasy day. He's your wide receiver 5 on the season. He's a top 15 wide receiver in 4 of his last 5 fantasy football games. Since week 9, he's averaging 6 receptions on 7 targets and 70 yards, has 2 touchdowns in that span. His playoff schedule. Green Bay, who will have the 12th fewest points to fantasy football wide receivers. I know it sounds tough, but it's not the worst matchup. The Vikings, who allow the most fantasy football points to wide receivers. And then the Bears, who allow the 3rd fewest. So the schedule is a little bit scary, but JSN plays in the slot a ton, so we probably won't be facing those top corners. And on top of that, the Seahawks are fighting for that number 1 spot in the NFC West. It does seem like JSN has lapped DK Metcalf as the favorite target of Geno Smith. He gets a ton of balls across the middle of the field where DK's kind of running on the outside a lot. I think he's kind of
doing that fade against Sauce, right?
He did, DK did have a great fade against Sauce. That was great. We spoke about that last week. I love that matchup with DK and Sauce. They were tugging at each other. They were having a ball. And I think they were actually having fun because they're 2 alpha competitors. And they both got the best of each other a couple times. So JSN to the moon. Don't worry about the matchups. If you had DK, like I have DK in me and Nick's league, I'd be a little concerned. But JSN to the moon, keep him locked and loaded for your playoffs. Number 3, who do you have?
So we're going to escape the teams and we're going to focus on a player, a guy I've probably had on the takeaway segment too many times this year, but I don't care. I'm pounding the desk on him as I've continued to do. I'm going to keep reinforcing it, and it is Josh Jacobs. I think he is quietly the hottest player in fantasy football at the moment. Over the last 4 games, he's the RB2. He's only behind Saquon Barkley. His floor in that span is 21.7. He's averaging 24.6 points per game in that span. He was a top 5 running back in all 4 of those games. 8 touchdowns in that span. The workload, crazy. He is up to an 80% snap share in 3 of those 4 games. The game he did not have an 80% snap share, he had 28.6 points on 26 carries. So screw the workload on that one. We got the number that we needed from him. Last week, he decimated the Lions on the ground. Something that no team or no running back has done this year. He put up the most points that any running back has in a singular game against the Lions all season. He is on a roll. His playoff schedule, one of the easiest in football as well. At Seattle, hosting the Saints, and then at Minnesota. A very, very good stretch for him, and he has proven to be matchup proof over the span. There is no doubt in my mind he will continue to be for your playoffs. Josh Jacobs, I love him. I have loved him. I loved him from the last 2 years on this show. I've been all over him. And I think this next season is the time where he really emerges. I think this year we had a bit of an outlier in the drafts. There were so many receivers drafted early. It's typically so running back heavy your first round. I think Josh Jacobs is going to be a first round pick next year. I think he's going to work his way up there. And if he's not, he's going to be in that Saquon range right at the end where it's right at the tail. And I think he's going to be locked and loaded right there too.
Yeah, it's a great thing that you have Josh Jacobs. I wish I had Josh Jacobs on a fantasy team. I definitely didn't trade him like 2 weeks ago.
No. Never. Did not happen.
I traded Josh Jacobs for T. Higgins in my dynasty league because I had Jonathan Taylor and I have Saquon Barkley, and I felt like I really needed a receiver. I like T. Higgins' age, and T's been – I traded him before the bye, so I missed a week due to the bye, And then T had 17.9 last week. I don't know what he's done on Monday Night Football yet, but we'll see how that one works out for me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll talk about a running back too. I'm going to talk about David Montgomery, who I don't think is getting a ton of love. Another guy that I may have sort of traded away. In that league, it was a better trade away. And I'm just ripping myself apart for these trades here. In that league, I have Bijan Robinson, Isaiah Pacheco, and I traded you for Kyron Williams. So I already have three pretty good backs. So I traded David Montgomery for Devontae Smith to get a solid receiver, and then he goes and tweaks his hamstring. So maybe I'm just bad with my luck when somebody comes back to me. But David Montgomery, running back 9 on the season, double-digit fantasy points in 12 out of 13 games. It's a model of consistency in your flex spot. Probably drafted him around 6, 7, 8. Didn't know what to expect. He has over 20 fantasy points, or 15 fantasy points, in 9 out of those 13 games. It's crazy. He leads the Lions in rushing attempts and touchdowns at 12. He's tied for second in the NFL with Kyron Williams for touchdowns in the league at 12, right behind Barkley and Derrick Henry. His playoff schedule is great. The Bills, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs, the Bears, who allow the 6th most fantasy points to running backs, and the 49ers, who allow the 8th most fantasy points to running backs. So if you have either Lions running back, Jahmyr Gibbs or David Montgomery, you are locked and loaded for the playoffs. And Dan the man with his gigantic balls of steel, like you're talking like Randy Marsh from South Park balls of steel. He trusted David Montgomery in that 4th down on Thursday night, and that's huge to put the game away. He trusts David Montgomery on every 4th down. And the guy who didn't get the 4th down last week, Nick, I'm pretty sure was Gibbs, the one that he went for it on the 30. I think it was Gibbs. They trust this guy a lot. It feels like anytime they're within the 5-yard line to the 1, it's just David Montgomery like 3 times, which is what I do in Madden and what infuriates Nick. But anyway, David Montgomery to the moon. I do wish I didn't trade him due to his playoff schedule, but I wouldn't have been able to play him in our league anyway. I probably should have shipped off Pacheco and Hunt if somebody would have taken him. But anyway, David Montgomery to the moon. Mm-hmm. Number 4, who do you have? And I do want to note here, I actually make a good trade. I need to give myself some credit here. In my Dynasty League, I traded for Saquon Barkley. I traded Tony Pollard a 1st and a 3rd, and Saquon's been phenomenal and has just won me a bunch of games. And I made a good trade with Nick here. I got Kyron Williams and Roma Dunze. This is a keeper league, by the way, after round 6 or 7. So it was Roma Dunze, who will now be my keeper, with Kyron Williams, who will hopefully win me the league. And I traded Nick Brian Thomas Jr., who is arguably probably the number 1 keeper next year, next to Brock Bowers. And I also gave you the Cardinals' backup name.
Trey Benson, who's on the waiver
Benson.
wire.
Yeah, now he's on the waiver wire. So I basically traded Brian Thomas Jr. for Kyron Williams and Roma Dunze. So those are my 2 good trades. Let's talk about my good trades. And the T. Higgins trade isn't labeled bad yet. He hasn't played enough. He's played 1 game for me.
T. Higgins averages the third most points per game at the wide receiver position. If he is out on that field, he is more than fine.
And I had to trade for him with the bye week because that was our trade deadline. So I couldn't say to him like, hey, let me get through T's bye week, but I had to. So that's just unfortunate luck. But I did win the fantasy league. It didn't cost me. Anyway, long soliloquy. Nick, your 4th takeaway from week 14 and talking about the playoffs.
So you plugged it in the first segment in our waiver wire. You talked about Matt Stafford. I had him and the Rams as a top 5 offense going into the fantasy football season. I had them at number 2, and they are the hottest offense in football right now for fantasy, especially with those 2 wide receivers. Matthew Stafford, last 4 games is the QB6. Kyron Williams, last 4 games is the RB7. Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 6. And Puka Nacua is the wide receiver 1 in that span. These guys have gone absolutely nuclear, and it always happens, and they are getting hot right when you want for real football, but especially when you want for fantasy football. Now they get the short week against the 49ers. We like that spot. They get at the New York Jets, who Nick already mentioned, very, very dinged up. Sauce has been injured. CJ Mosley's been injured. A lot of injuries on that Jets secondary. Very good opportunity for this explosive offense. Just put up 44 against the Bills, who are arguably a top 10 defense in football. Then you get home for Arizona, who gave them a little bit of trouble earlier in the year, but they weren't as healthy as they are now. So that's going to be a very good spot for them. We know the skill guys are matchup proof at this point. Stafford is the guy that's matchup dependent, and that's why you got to love him for fantasy, man. I always say it. There's nothing better than knowing, like, for example, Tua. Nick talked about it earlier. our Dolphins, Nick and I have been spot on this all year. When Tua's been out there, they have been great. When Tua is not out there, only Achane has been reliable. And Achane was not the superstar running back.
He's reliable, but Tua makes him, as Nick has stated, literally the running back one on the season. Nick gave the stats, I think it was 2 weeks ago on our Tuesday episode. Achane without Tua has been the running back one on the season by a pretty wide margin.
Yeah, and he's on pace with Tua to have over 100 catches this year. Not targets, catches, which is absolutely nuts.
Not getting enough love, honestly, because if that was McCaffrey, he would be getting the love.
Oh, absolutely. And Achane's going to get the love next year when he's a top 10 pick, but he might be near the bottom of that 10, unfortunately.
But I feel like a lot of fantasy analysts, not named Nick, next year will be, I mean, a fantasy analyst, but average fantasy players will be saying Achane, Dolphins. Why?
Depends on how they finish the season. If they sneak into the playoffs, it'll be a different story. And they've got their marching orders. The schedule's not too difficult. But anyway, listen, that's what we love for fantasy football. You love to know this guy's matchup proof, this guy's matchup dependent, and that's exactly what the Rams offense have been. You know, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Kyren Williams are always out there, and you can trust Stafford in those good matchups. That's what you want for fantasy, and that's what this team is. And they have heated up at the perfect time for you. If you're a Cooper Kupp owner, if you're a Puka Nacua owner, expect to go on a big championship run because I think they're going to win you a lot of money this year.
I'm going to talk about Trey McBride, who Nick spoke about, I think, a week or two ago. And if you want a model of consistency at the tight end position, he has been the model of consistency. Tight end 3 on the season, double-digit fantasy points in 10 out of 12 games that he's played. But every game that he's played since week 5, he had 2 stinkers. I think it was weeks 1 and 3, and then he got a little dinged up. So since week 5, he's your tight end 2. He has 7 targets in 7 out of 9 games that he's played since week 5. He leads the Cardinals in both receptions, targets, and yards. He does have no touchdowns. That is the only thing that's holding him back. He's having a Kyle Pitts-like season, Kyle Pitts rookie season. I think he had 950 yards and no touchdowns. He didn't get his first touchdown until sophomore year. I do think that McBride is going to score a touchdown at some point in these playoffs because he has a great playoff schedule. He's facing the Patriots this weekend, who allow the 16th fewest points to tight ends, basically middle of the pack. Then he has the Panthers, who allow the most fantasy points to tight ends. And then he has the Rams, who allow the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends. That should be a high-scoring game. Week 2, the Cardinals won big, but there was no Puka Nacua. There was no Cooper Kupp. It was kind of just a Kyren and Stafford show, but they were not a healthy team. The Rams are healthy now. And the NFC West matchups down the stretch are huge. You have the 49ers and the Rams this week. The Seahawks will have the Rams week 18, I believe. The Rams are going to have the Cardinals. That's week 17. So huge NFC West matchups. They'll all be competing probably right down until the last week. I think McBride's going to get into the end zone, not just with Carolina, but also with the Rams. I would expect big performances in both of those weeks. If you did draft McBride higher than other tight ends, you're reaping the rewards because he's been better than Kelsey. He's been better than the Laporta potty. He's been better than a bunch of guys that were drafted towards the high end of that draft. And if you got Bowers or McBride, I bet you're a top 2 seed in your fantasy football league, unless you got snap with a ton of injuries. Mm-hmm. I know at the end of the year, fantasy analysts will always say player X was on 90% of championship teams. I bet when I look at the tight end, it will be Bowers or McBride that are on the majority of those championship teams.
I agree.
All right, your 5th and final fantasy football takeaway from week 14.
We couldn't go this week where an illustrious streak was broken without talking about the New York Jets. And that
we did talk about it. We talked about it.
Fantastic loss. Aaron Rodgers' first 300-yard game in about 3 years. We love to see it. We love to see it. All right, there we go, Aaron. We're coming back for next year now. I don't know if we want that. Anyway, but what I really want to talk about on the Jets offense is someone who's been very sneaky on fire with their workload, with their points, and it's been Davante Adams. My guy, I've always loved him. For our new viewers, I am the big Davante Adams guy on the show. I've hated Davante Adams until he was traded to the New York Jets. I've been the biggest outspoken Davante critic.
You have no reason. So I do want to state, Nick has no reason to dislike Davante Adams. He just always thought that Davante Adams was a little bit overdrafted and was predicting the downfall of Davante Adams for a couple years.
That's true. I mean,
it's part of personal. You didn't lose a bet. They didn't cost the Jets anything. It was nothing personal. And you're a Packers owner.
I have been the I am a Packers owner. I do own a share of the Packers. I own 0.00009% of the Packers, just so you all know. But I have been the opposite of the general media on Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers was loved by the media up until he went to the New York Jets. I have hated Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers and Davante Adams up until he was a New York Jet. So I've been on the total flip side of most of the media who have flipped when he comes to New York and all this stuff's out there and he's going to Egypt and missing all this time and bringing in Randall Cobb and all that stuff. But anyway, on to Davante Adams. Here's his last 5 games. 22 points, 9, a little low, 13. Then bye week, 18, 26. The target share in those 5 games is the big note. 11, 13, 7, 12, and 11. That is phenomenal target share. Now you get to go down to Jacksonville, a team that allows top 5 points per game to the wide receiver position. Then you go against the Rams, an absolute shootout spot. The Rams front 7 has been pretty good. That team allows a lot of points to a lot of teams, not just Buffalo. That defense is not great. Championship week, Buffalo. Tough defense. We just watched Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp tear through them. No, Aaron Rodgers is not what Matthew Stafford is anymore. But when they played in week 4, Garrett Wilson put up 24.7 and Alan Lazard put up 23.4. Those two combined for a phenomenal fantasy day. I think Davante Adams, of all the wide receivers, all the running backs, all the guys in that middling range, not your top 5 guys like your Jamar Chases and your Pukas and all those guys, and not those lower guys like your Jerry Judys who are exploding on the scene and guys like that. I think Davante Adams is the middle receiver that's going to win more people money and win more people fantasy championships than anybody. I'm predicting that he's going to finish with a top 5 next 3 games for the rest of the year.
I think Alan Lazard won me a week. I think it was a Monday night game against the Bills. I'm pretty sure Lazard won me a week in a league that I'm going to have a buy-in. So that's pretty cool.
There you go.
We also could not go throughout the entirety of this show without talking about our guy, J-Bo, Mr. Jameis Winston. But my take isn't totally on Jameis. It's actually about Jerry Jeudy, who Jameis has turned into a star. He's a wide receiver 11 on the season. And I know that 11 doesn't sound too sexy to you guys, but Jeudy wasn't really drafted. Nobody wanted to touch Jerry Jeudy with a 39.5-foot pole for you fans of the Grinch coming up. All right, so let's talk about since Jameis Winston took over as a starter for Jerry Jeudy. Double digits in 6 consecutive games since Jameis started. Wide receiver 4 since week 8. His playoff games are against the Kansas City Chiefs, who allow the 11th most points to wide receivers, the Cincinnati Bengals, who before Monday Night Football allowed the 16th most fantasy points to receivers. I know that's not a great number, but the Bengals defense has looked bad. Anybody who's watched the NFL this season can tell you the Bengals defense has looked bad. And then championship weeks against Miami. It's a tougher spot against wide receivers, but the Dolphins will be competing for a playoff spot. The Browns will look to play spoiler. And even if the game gets out of hand, Jameis is going to keep slinging it. Jeudy, 38 receptions, 55 targets, 678 yards, and 2 touchdowns since week 8. And in those 6 games, he faced 3 top 10 defenses and still put up those numbers. The Broncos and the Steelers twice. And the Broncos was his best game of the season. So do not be afraid to start Jerry Jeudy. Another guy like Jackson Smith and Jigba locked and loaded into those playoff lineups.
Just a quick point for you, because I did the last 4 weeks. Jerry Jeudy since week 11, wide receiver 2, only behind Puka Nacua in that span. So Nick is spot on here. Jerry Jeudy is crushing it, and he is going to win a lot of people a lot of fantasy money.
It's a shame that Jameis didn't start from week 1. He should have.
Yep.
All right, guys, that is our first show heading into week 15. Thank you so much for supporting. If you're a new watcher or listener that you jumped on, and maybe you're a Stoolie, love the Stoolies and love the Barstool community. So thank you guys for that. Hopefully you enjoyed this show. Drop a like on it if you're on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. I also should note this show is absolutely not affiliated with Barstool. This is our personal show. I should state that. I don't think anybody thought it was a Barstool show, but I cannot stress that enough. But anyway, appreciate you guys that are first-time listeners, however you found the show. If you enjoyed the show on YouTube, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon so you have notifications on whenever we go live or drop a new video. The next one will come out on Thursday. If you're listening on an audio streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Anchor, thank you so much. Make sure to subscribe to the show. And if you're on iTunes or Spotify, a 5-star rating and a review would be very much appreciated. If you have any fantasy football questions or just want to interact with us, go to our Twitter/X Primetime FF Pod or Instagram Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. We're also on Facebook. I know not a lot of people use Facebook, but Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast is Facebook as well. Thank you for the support. Thank you for the shout outs. Thank you for the love. And we want to help you guys the best we can week 15. We'll talk to you guys on Thursday. We'll talk to you guys on Sunday. Set those waiver wires and talk soon.